Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. Today we're going to talk about Bob Dylan. It's not entirely unusual for me to sometimes talk about famous rock songs. In fact, this channel began with quite a detailed discussion about some songs from the Beatles' Revolver. That was about 3 years ago. How far we've come since those early days. I'm here with Loki. Lie, Loki, lie. That's a little Dylan reference there. Lie, Loki, lie. Loki's going to help me to present this discussion. So we're going to talk about one of Dylan's most iconic songs from the mid-60s, right in the middle of the decade, and that's his seminal song, Like a Rolling Stone, one of his most famous songs. It's also the song that to some extent is the climax of the current, I say current because it's in cinemas right now, film, the Timothy Chalamet film about Dylan, called Complete Unknown. I did a tiny review of that film last week because I went to see it and enjoyed it. And in the film, Like a Rolling Stone has a sort of, a climactic role at the end of the movie, marking the point at which Dylan famously transitioned from being a folk singer and a kind of hippie messiah to becoming a rock star, going electric. I mean, of course, Dylan had no doubt considered going electric at some point. He was one of these people, he's a restless spirit. And let me say something about restless spirits at this point in the discussion. I think it's an essential feature of really major artists, and I think Dylan does fall into that category. Whatever you think about his music, and I'll try and make sense of that in a minute. You might say, let's go back to someone we discuss quite often on the channel, Ludwig van Beethoven, a huge cultural figure of the turn of the 19th century, where he, having established himself as somebody within a certain tradition, an inheritor of the mantle of Haydn and Mozart, there's a kind of volte-face quality that occurs at the beginning of his middle period when he suddenly produces the Eroica Symphony and the Waldstein Sonata and all these huge groundbreaking pieces that are absolutely revolutionary in every sense of that word. Sometimes great artists do this volte-face thing. I say volte-face, it's a sort of, to some extent, both consolidating their reputation but also rejecting the tradition from which they come. In Beethoven's case, rejecting an element of the tradition, which was a certain elegance and balance that you find in the late classical style and in the great late works of Haydn and Mozart. But to some degree in the Eroica Symphony, Beethoven turns that around. He breaks out of that beautiful balanced mould and produces something epic and sort of crazy and splurgy and all over the place. You get it with a number of leading early 20th century artists like, for example, Pablo Picasso, who's constantly reinventing he starts in a certain way as a traditional painter, rapidly breaks free of that traditional association and keeps doing it, keeps producing these absolutely trailblazing paintings which in a sense turn their back on what he's done prior to that moment. And a marvellous musical example is Igor Stravinsky, who's always turning his back on something. And notice Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, the famous masterpiece that brought him such celebrity after its first performance in 1913 and provoked a tremendous riot. And that is equivalent in some ways to what happened to Bob Dylan. Now, I realise that Bob Dylan is not in any way musically similar to the people I've mentioned, but he is similar in another sense, that as a sort of cultural iconic figure and as somebody who came out of a particular tradition, a sort of country blues, folk, minstrel tradition in America, he broke out of that tradition in order to release himself into something bigger and grander and with a bigger audience. And that is this transfer to becoming a sort of electric rock musician in the mid-1960s. And it provoked, as the instances before I mentioned the Rite of Spring, it provoked a backlash, a sort of outburst. Famously, in the concert that he actually gave in Manchester, in the movie, if you've seen it, it occurs at Newport Folk Festival. That's a fabrication, but it's a sort of neat one to put sort of situated at the Folk Festival. But that's not how it happened. It happened in Manchester in the Free Trade Hall in 1966, when Dylan appeared before the audience who are wanting to hear the folk messiah sing his wonderful early songs, you know, Blowing in the Wind and The Times They Are Changing and so on. And no, he appears with the band and they do a performance of these numbers with entirely electric, with the kit and guitars and so forth. And somebody shouts out from the audience, Judas!
I don't believe you.
You know, the ultimate word signifying betrayal. You are the one who's betrayed everything. We looked up to you as a messiah figure, but it turns out you're Judas. And Dylan responds first by saying, I don't believe you, you're a liar, and then saying, play it effing loud. And they play Rolling Stone. Have a look, here's some footage.
You're a liar.
So just coming out of that clip, interesting to think about what happened in the mid-60s. It's a huge cultural shift. The 60s themselves are such an explosive decade, and right there in the middle, there is this very explosive thing that happens. It's not just Dylan, it's exactly the same period as the Beatles transition from their early kind of rock and roll version of themselves to the psychedelic version of themselves. Albums like Revolver and subsequently Sgt. Pepper, where the band are entirely reinventing themselves. So you see it happening with them as well. And with Dylan, I think there's an element where the beautiful early songs, it's absolutely authentic to who he was, but he began to feel that whatever he was by the mid-60s wasn't the same person as at the beginning of the 1960s. You know, singing wonderful, progressive, civil rights-y songs like the magnificent Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. I mean, that's a wonderful ballad. Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall. There are various songs that fall into that category. But to some degree, Dylan was feeling trapped in terms of that. He didn't want to just be that kind of singer. He wanted to break out. And so there are various accounts of him writing almost a stream of consciousness type of thing, which at the time he wondered whether it should become a play or a novel. So, for example, in one interview he said, last spring I guess I was going to quit singing. I was very drained in the way things were going. It's a very draggy situation. But like a Rolling Stone changed it all. And in another interview he said, he described it as this long piece of vomit, 20 pages long. And out of it I took like a Rolling Stone and made it as a single. So there's this sense that there was an extraordinary, long, protracted creative process going on. And I think some of this creative energy is connected to his friendship with Allen Ginsberg, one of the famous beat poets, with whom Dylan was very close at the time, and Ginsberg wrote about him, very, very perceptively wrote about Dylan. His image was undercurrent, underground, unconscious in people, something a little more mysterious, poetic, a little more dada, more where people's hearts and heads actually were rather than where they should be, according to some ideological angry theory. Absolutely sums up what this song is, actually. It's Dylan breaking out of what people should be ideologically, the protest singer, the sort of worthy figure that Dylan was meant to be. But there's something much more enigmatic and mysterious about Bob Dylan as an artist, and I think he wanted to go into that more mysterious place. And the song, therefore, originally emerged as what he called this long stream of vomit or whatever, this Ginsbergian stream of consciousness, out of which he subtracted these 4 verses. I mean, even so, it ended up being over 6 minutes long, which is almost twice as long as any pop song up to that time, you know, commercial pop song. So it's a huge sprawling mass of a song. But even so, it's actually very, very concise compared with what it originally was. Now, I promise we're not going to have a really detailed analysis, but I want to talk about 1 or 2 key things. One striking thing about this song is it's in C major, the brightest, simplest key, the most innocent key. And when you hear the famous sound of Dylan's band at the beginning with its kind of strange radiance, have a listen. So you've got an organ there, you've got a sort of bluesy guitar element, you have a tambourine, drum kit, bass. Fantastic session players. All the contributors were brilliant musicians, but they were all distinctly unprepared for this take, and that's part of what makes it so brilliant, I think. With Dylan, of course, in the middle, singing, playing the harmonica, doing his usual thing. But it's this bright C major, kind of radiant C major with the Hammond organ famously floating in a kind of mysterious way over the top. I should say, famously, the Hammond organ was played by someone called Al Cooper, who was a session player, session guitarist, not an organist. He'd come into the session almost by accident, was sitting in on it, wondered whether he could join in, realised that when he heard Mike Bloomfield, brilliant blues guitarist who was playing lead on the track, was so good, he put his guitar away and then sort of floated in the direction of the Hammond organ, and by a fluke was allowed to play on this take only. And there he was. And you can actually hear in the track that he's slightly hesitant. He said later, and I believe him, that he didn't actually know exactly what the chord progressions were on the song. And so he tends to come in a quaver or two late. It's really fascinating to hear how tentative his playing often is on the track. But he's not the only one. If you listen to the track very closely, you can hear that nobody's playing it very cleanly. I don't think the musicians know it that well. Dylan had turned up the day before and played it in a kind of waltz tempo in 3/4. So there was something a bit kind of unprepared about it. And sometimes marvellous things happen when people aren't entirely ready and there's a kind of accidental raggedness about it. Apparently they did a number of takes after this, but this was the one that had the energy and the kind of coarse, rough, but it's wrong but right kind of feel about it. And I absolutely believe in that kind of thing. We live in an era where, recording is far too pristine, far too mechanically orientated. Technology comes along, cleans up everything, removes any mistunings and all that kind of thing. This track feels absolutely real and authentic and raw and kind of fantastic. And what's amazing is the radiance and the simplicity of the C major collides with the kind of brutal, abrasive, kind of sneering quality of Dylan's lyrics. There's something mysteriously like a curse about the song. It seems to be sung to a woman, an affluent woman who's fallen on hard times. In fact, she seems to be out on the street, and yet there's a kind of sneering quality in the lyrics, but at the same time, at the choruses, a kind of celebration about the freedom, how amazing it is to have no direction home, to be complete unknown. How does it feel? It's almost Dylan celebrating in that way that I think touched people's hearts at that time in the mid-60s. We don't know where we are. All the security, all the safety, all the sense of where we are has gone. The rug has been pulled out under our feet. We don't feel secure anymore. Society is changing. Everything is changing. The hierarchies, the norms, the old bourgeois values are all being stripped away. So you can see why the song had this amazing resonance for people. It seems possible that Dylan was in fact partly inspired by someone he knew, Edie Sedgwick, the kind of it girl of the mid-1960s, who had been part of Andy Warhol's circle, had come from a very privileged background, had sort of been treated quite shoddily. Having been for a while Andy Warhol's right-hand person, always appearing with him in public, appearing in some of his films and being this kind of a public face of the Andy Warhol factory, she'd kind of been cast aside. And this had led to drug addiction and all sorts of horrors. And I think Dylan is perhaps partly inspired by that. And because she's just died, let me say something else, which is that the trajectory of the song also mirrors, to some extent, the life of Marianne Faithfull. Also a great celebrity model actress in Britain in the 1960s, girlfriend of Mick Jagger, who also came from a very privileged background and ended up famously in the early 1970s on the street, living homeless, living like a homeless person. So the song points at an actual phenomenon that affected some very prominent women of the time, and I think that shows very much the dark side of the 1960s. It was an era that was associated with freedom and revolution and, to some extent, flower power and joy and nice things, hippiness, but also very dark things, very troubling things. Exploitation, sexual freedoms that didn't have any responsibilities and therefore went horribly off the rails, drug addiction, these really dark elements as well. So the song does reflect on that, but it's deeper than that. It's not really about a person. You could say, as I've hinted at, that it's a song about society itself. It's certainly a song about Dylan himself, because Dylan himself knew what it was like to have no direction home. He'd come to New York in the early 1960s, very much a complete unknown, as the current film points out. He himself knew what it was like to shed everything and to find himself somehow in the process of being completely unfettered. In the mid-60s, he felt particularly alone, having made this change, being rejected, or having rejected and been rejected by the folk music community. So the lyrics are partly directed at himself, I think. And he too is reflecting on how these moments of deep anguish and pain and loss can also be moments of regeneration and a kind of new creative energy. Isn't that fascinating, the way all these things are distilled in the most poetic way, I think, in this song? Something else interesting that Ginsberg had said about Dylan was that he was returning music to its connection with the human body through the musical component. So in other words, there is a poetic element here, and I think is absolutely true. And I'm sure many of you weren't surprised when Dylan received the Nobel Prize for Literature, because he always was a poet. That's what he was. He was a poet who set his poems to music. And it isn't as simple as setting poetry to music, because it isn't really that. It's that the poetry and the music are the same thing. The music underpins the poetry, and I think that's what Ginsberg meant, that he was returning poetry to its ancient connection with the body and with music. This goes right back to ancient times, to think of Homer, the old tradition of the lyric poet whose words are performed with some kind of musical accompaniment. That's how the two were always joined together. In a curious way, Dylan taps in, as you know, this is what pop music has done in the 20th century to some extent, is this bringing together of music and words. So Dylan was fusing the two together. Now, the musical content, of course, is fantastically simple in that the song begins with a rising pattern of just parallel triads. You know, this is not what classical music ever does, except Debussy occasionally, but the rising parallels, chord 1, C major, D minor, E minor, F, chord 4, rising up to the dominant. It's the simplest thing imaginable, utterly primitive, and yet absolutely essential in a curious way to the meaning of the song. So you climb to the dominant.
Once upon a time you dressed so fine, through the bumps of time in your prime.
So the song has a rising pattern going up 1, 2, 3, 4, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, chord 4 to the dominant. Every time in the song you hear this rising figure, it's always associated with the past, with the world that once was, the privilege, the fact that you used to throw bums a dime and so forth. Then you get a kind of blues-like hovering between 4 and 5, where he reflects on that, on what he's just said at the beginning.
You used to laugh about.
And then a downward fall. In the song, it's always about and now you don't look so fine. Or there's the much darker element to the lyric about how that's no longer the case, now you're in this place.
Now you don't talk so loud.
And then we have this marvellous, brilliant build-up to the dominant, and then the extraordinary chorus, which then breaks out in this very rhetorical, repetitive way. And Dylan's vocal, how does it feel? And he always goes up to the 4th note. Do you notice that? And it's not mistuning. He's very good actually at hitting the note when he wants to. Feel! He hits this F, which doesn't resolve, and so it leaves a question hanging over the lyric. How does it feel? It's interesting that the chorus isn't preachy, it isn't telling the person anything about, it isn't making a judgment, it's simply asking the question. How does it feel to be on your own, and so on. This is a good point to briefly mention Dylan's fascinating vocal delivery. A lot of people hate it. Part of the problem with Dylan's vocal delivery is it doesn't work as a background kind of entity. You can't put a Dylan song very easily in the background at a party and expect people to enjoy it, because it doesn't work that way. It's very much foreground music. It's music you have to listen to, you have to concentrate, you have to have the lyrics in front of you to get what he's doing. Once you do that, you realise that he's communicating in this marvellously eloquent way. The lyrics are always presented in a rhythmically magnificent way. I mean, look at the first line. Once upon a time you dressed so fine. It's that marvellous sort of urgency that has a cross-rhythmic feel. Once upon a time you dressed so fine. Just pushing the beat. Through the bums a dime. And you've always got this glissando off the rhyming word, just like speech. Because there's another fascinating thing that Dylan managed to discover, something that Schoenberg had tried to, a kind of problem that Schoenberg had tried to solve at the beginning of the 20th century. How do you combine song and speech? Schoenberg did it by inventing something called Sprechgesang in his famous work Pierre Lunaire. But to be honest, Dylan does it more successfully, I think, in his songs, where something between speech and song is discovered in these songs, with this kind of glissando. Glissando off the accented points of the song, very close to what Schoenberg said should happen in Sprechgesang, funnily enough. And there's a marvellous rhythmic energy in the song, where you've got this, through the bums a dime, in your prime. 1, 2, didn't you? You know, that wonderful weight at the end, and then the little question is asked. Fantastic. The lyrics are, of course, brilliant, with all these internal rhymes and curious cross-rhythmic accents, but set to music, it's electrifying. This is the thing I think people don't quite get, how clever it is. It seems abrasive and odd and unattractive if you're not into Dylan. If you're into Dylan, you suddenly realise this is magnificent. This is poetry electrified by some kind of musical current running through it. One last thing that I'm interested in with this song, because I'm not sure that it's ever been answered entirely satisfactorily, is these mysterious lines in Dylan's poetry, which seem rather surreal. And they're there, it seems, partly because of the fact that they sound beautiful or interesting. I'll give you an example. A terrific line here where it says, with the mystery tramp, but now you realise he's not selling any alibis, as you stare into the vacuum of his eyes and say, do you want to make a deal? I mean, it's clearly a Lucifer image, isn't it, that comes up in Dylan's songs quite often. There's a later, distinctly creepy Dylan song called Man in the Long Black Coat, which has this kind of Lucifer image, and he turns up in Dylan songs from time to time, but here it's clearly a Faustian reference. It's about how when you're down and out and when you're in the darkest place, you're striking a deal. This sort of Faustian thing crops up a lot in Western art, doesn't it? I mentioned Stravinsky at the start of this video. Think about Stravinsky, who's a sort of Faustian figure in some ways. He wrote The Soldier's Tale, and much later in his career, he wrote The Rake's Progress, both of them versions of the Faust myth. And here is Dylan doing the same thing, referring to this Faustian thing. So it seems to me that something of the same figure is being alluded to when he also talks about, there's a line, you used to ride on a chrome horse with your diplomat, who carried on his shoulder a Siamese cat. I know that in the 60s, Andy Warhol was sure that this was referring to him because of the whole Edie Sedgwick connection. And there's a third line, isn't there, in the poem where it talks about Napoleon in rags, this mysterious sort of hobo-ish figure. Some commentators have wondered whether there's also a link with the country blues tradition and figures like Blind Lemon Jefferson and so on. But we won't go into all that because it's too complicated. These are just enigmatic things on the fringes of the song, but they're very, very interesting. And it seems to me that, yes, there's a strong suggestion of a Faustian undercurrent in the lyrics. So that's enough, I think, really just to open the door for anyone interested in trying to work out what Dylan's all about. And this fascinating song that comes right from the heart of the 20th century and I think has tremendous cultural meaning now as it did then. A tremendous enigmatic, almost prophetic message to the era that we live in. Fascinating song. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe, press the little bell, and if you like the channel, consider donating. Thank you very much.